Thank you all, and thank you, Ravi DC and Govind. It's my first time at KLF, and it's an absolute honor to come back to Calicut, which is the home of Paragon Restaurant, the best restaurant in the world, no less. So Dr. Tharoor, thank you so much for being here. This book is absolutely timely. Can you share with the audience that 26th of November was the first time that the Constitution was presented in Parliament, and what happened and what led to the reading of the Constitution or putting it together? What was Dr. Ambedkar's role in it? What was Nehru's advice to Dr. Ambedkar at that point of time that created what we now see as one of the greatest documents in this last century? Justice Albie Sachs, the Supreme Court Justice in South Africa, when he was as part of their Constituent Assembly, he said, we have borrowed heavily from the Indian Constitution because in this century it is about the most perfect document that's been created.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Yeah, well, there's a whole history behind the creation of the Indian Constitution. In some ways, the whole thing goes back to the 1920s. Mahatma Gandhi, back in 1922, said that we need our own constitution. Then you remember there were various efforts made. The Motilal Nehru report came out also in the 1920s, in which it actually proposed a constitution for India, which had many of the features that we subsequently were to see in the later constitution. And then when the British finally decided that they were going to conduct their first Brexit, we had, after the elections of 1946, the creation of a constituent assembly to write the Constitution. And that was an immense task, bedeviled by the fact that partition occurred within a short while of the work of the Constituent Assembly starting. The Muslim League boycotted it initially. Then, of course, with partition, they left the Assembly. The remainder had to restart and redo it. It became an extraordinary effort. And the chairman of the drafting committee, as Sanjoy mentioned, was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was not a congressman and who had initially been elected from a constituency in what became East Pakistan. Therefore, he was re-elected after a Congress member resigned, and he was able to come into office. And as soon as he came in, he was invited by Nehruji and Rajendra Prasad, who was chairing the Constituent Assembly, to head the drafting committee. Now, they produced a constitution that was a truly remarkable document in every conceivable way, 145,000 words. To give you a comparison, the American Constitution is 4,400 words. Okay, the German Constitution is about the longest in the Western world, it's about 20,000.
22,000.
Yeah, the French are 8,800, something like that. So you're looking at something that was far larger than any other constitution written existing in the world and covered every conceivable contingency, so much so that some people objected to that. And then, then there were other concerns. The RSS said this is basically full of imported Western ideas and written in the wrong language, namely English. A Congress Constituent Assembly member called Hanumantayya said that we were expecting the music of the veena or the sitar, and instead we got the orchestra of an English band. So there was all of this criticism. But it was a remarkable document because it actually did take into account the achievements of constitutions elsewhere in the world. The British, British was not written, but the principles there. The American Constitution, the Australian Constitution, the Irish Constitution, all sorts of ideas came into discussion in the drafting committee. And they finally came up with a constitution which in many ways reflected the wishes of the freedom struggle leaders. And in many ways, perhaps the key decision, well, there were several key decisions, but the most important one was they decided to extend the franchise to all Indians of both genders and irrespective of any other qualification, which was not the case when the British had grudgingly extended the vote to Indians slowly, so that as late as the 1946 elections, in a country of 330 million people, only 30 million were entitled to vote, because you had to have either a degree or property or a title, various other criteria. And of course, in our country where the British had done nothing to promote literacy, and only 16% of Indians were literate. Only 8.8% of Indian women could even read and write. In that situation, we had very, very few people eligible. But the Indian Constituent Assembly said, no, we're going to give everyone the vote. They also decided to end the pernicious British practice of communal electorates, where, say, Muslim voters were inscribed in a separate list where they could only vote for Muslim candidates for Muslim seats. That was done away with in the Constitution. Sardar Patel wrote to Ambedkar saying, don't forget that this is what led to partition, this kind of different divide and rule mindset of the British, so let's not do that. The Constitution had many special features, but above all, very strong fundamental rights. And I would argue, those rights included rights which today are being debated in the country, such as the issue of secularism. We can come to that later if you want. But given all of this, it was a remarkable document. It was adopted, as Sanjay points out, on 26 November 1949. So why do we celebrate 26 January as the day the Constitution came into force? For a simple reason. Way back in 1931, the Congress Party had called for Purna Swaraj, full independence for the first time. And from 1931, every year, Indians had celebrated, Indian nationalists had celebrated January 26th as Independence Day. But in 1947, when independence came, it came on August 15. So the term Independence Day had now been taken by a different date. And for the freedom struggle leaders, this had such emotional resonance, the date of January 26th. They said, whenever we may agree on the Constitution and adopt it in the Constituent Assembly, let us nonetheless actually celebrate 26 January as Republic Day, because that preserves the sanctity of that date. So that's why that we celebrate 26 January as Republic Day and August 15 as Independence Day. And I hope I've answered all of Sanjay's multiple questions that he asked in one, but there you are.
Dr. Tharoor, one of the amazing things about the Constitution, which is not in the book, or the photograph is not there, that the first one was actually handwritten, and it had the most amazing art led by Nandalal Bose.
It was actually calligraphed. So handwritten, yes, but so exquisitely that nobody will have any difficulty reading every word. And as he says, Nandalal Bose, the great artist, painted original paintings on every page. So it's an extra, paintings from ancient Indian civilization, from the myths, from various symbols of India. It's an exquisite work. But I have some good news for all of you. There were only a limited number of copies that he painted. Obviously, 3 is what I think, if I remember correctly.
And then 11 more that were sort of copied.
Some were reproduced at that time. And in fact, as late as the 90s, I remember a Calcutta second-hand bookshop on College Street had one of those first prints at 300 copies or whatever. They had one available for just 3,000 rupees. And I thought I would not buy it because I could not take care of it in my peripatetic life as a UN official. One of my biggest regrets. But the good news is that now the Parliament of India has reprinted a facsimile edition of the Constitution in the original size with excellent print copies of all Nandalal Bose's illustrations and the calligraphy. So I would recommend that you go and get yourself a copy. I have to confess, as an MP, I got one free. It'll cost you a little penny, but it's certainly worth it. It's a beautiful, beautiful book.
So this particular constitution, of course, was the original constitution, which did not have the word secular. During emergency, when the word secular was introduced, one of the arguments was, and has always been, that the idea of secularity or equidistance from every religion had been built into the language of the Constitution and therefore not needed to be explicitly said. The fact that today we need that word and it's being argued, how do you see this living Constitution of ours being changed or appropriated by other voices over time?
Okay, I'll answer that, but your question implies a larger question that I do want to address. On the question of the word secular, it's very simple. Actually, the question did come up during the Constituent Assembly, and Dr. Ambedkar said, I'm not going to specify secular because the policy of every government depends on the mandate they get from the people, and they can decide. However, the fact is that the Articles 25 to 28 of the Constitution, which give you not only the freedom of religion, the right to worship as you wish, but even the right to propagate your faith, and essentially guarantee the right of every Indian citizen to practice their own faith in the way in which they deem appropriate, that is de facto what we understand by secularism. So whether you have the word secularism or secular or not, the constitution is secular. That can't be changed. Now coming back to
But
Sanjay's,
yet, Dr. Tharoor, today, if you're practicing in your own home, as we've just seen recently, you can be arrested, especially if you're Muslim.
So what is happening now? Well, no, also Christians have also endured some attacks, particularly in some of the Hindi heartland states.
And Orissa.
And the problem is some of these states have passed, quote unquote, anti-conversion laws, which ostensibly outlaw conversion by inducement or force, but in practice are being weaponized by vigilante groups who are not actually government bodies. These are sort of private organized bands of, many cases, thugs. They have been going around intruding on people's freedom of worship by claiming that what they were doing was preventing forced conversion or conversion by allurement. Now, this has created a real situation of tension in many parts of the North. You know that there is a particular problem amongst the Christians in the tribal belts and in other areas, and there is also a problem for Muslims in some other areas. All I can say on this one is that the time does not yet seem to have come when a case has arisen that would actually raise a constitutional challenge against these anti-conversion laws. And I don't know how such a challenge would work out in the Supreme Court. But if you look at the provisions of these anti-conversion laws, they have by and large been drafted in a way, because already in any situation, forcing anyone to convert is obviously illegal anyway. And the law simply puts into black and white something that was already de facto illegal. Allurement is a little more difficult to prove. And therefore, arguing that somebody was induced or allured to convert would be a little more challenging. The bigger question, however, is how do you square these state anti-conversion laws with the provisions of the Constitution that guarantee freedom of religion, freedom of worship, and freedom to propagate religion? This is something only the Supreme Court can pronounce definitively on. But I think all of us will have our views on this. This is going to be a very key issue. But Sanjay, you mentioned the question of our living constitution. I do want to mention something that has evolved since the constitution was adopted. And that is, in the early 1970s, the idea of the basic structure. You see, when Ambedkar spoke to the Constituent Assembly, he said the Constitution was a living document. He had no intention of prescribing everything for future generations, that the Constitution had been made fairly easy to amend so that it could be responsive to the needs of future generations. And that was therefore part of the original design of the Constitution. I should mention that in the debates, Ambedkar got his way on some things and didn't get his way on some things. I'll give you an example. It's well known that he was actually in favor of the presidential system for India. But the majority of the freedom fighters were very enamored of the parliamentary system, partly because they had been denied a genuine parliamentary system by the British. You know, the Americans, when they conducted their revolution in 1776, had said they were fighting for the rights of Englishmen. And in many ways, that's what we were also fighting for in the 1930s and 40s. We were fighting for the rights of Englishmen that the English had denied to us. So the feeling was, if they could deny the parliamentary system to us, it must be a good thing to have. And so the majority wanted that. And Ambedkar rationalized this in the end in his speech to the assembly by saying that one, privileges executive action and so on. The other privileges accountability to parliament. But de facto, you can have a continued debate. I have been writing against the parliamentary system and for the presidential system since my student days in the Indian press. And I've made speeches on the subject. We can go a whole different argument about that as to why. Because I believe that the way the parliamentary system has worked in our country, once the elected government has a parliamentary majority, which for most of India's existence it has had, the legislature is reduced to a rubber stamp. Nobody in the legislature is going to challenge his own or her own prime minister and government or cabinet, least of all after the anti-defection law, when you no longer have the right to vote against your party whip. So what has happened now is that the whole spirit what Montesquieu, the famous French political philosopher, called l'esprit des lois, the spirit of the laws, which is you must have three different co-equal branches of government balancing each other, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. That has been destroyed in the parliamentary system because the legislature becomes completely a rubber stamp for the executive, except in those rare periods when the executive was a weak coalition government that could fall anytime. Then the legislature had more power, only then. Conversely, in a presidential system, where neither the survival of the president is dependent on the legislature, nor the survival of the legislature is dependent on the president, you actually have genuine accountability of the executive to the legislature, where the legislature cannot be imposed, you can't have a whip and defection issues and so on. There's no incentive to defect, because by defecting, you don't actually get any governmental office, since the legislature is completely independent of the executive, and you actually have a far more accountable government. That's a different argument, but I mentioned that simply since we talked about Ambedkar. But what he's talking about the Constitution being a living and enabling document is important for us to understand in the context of Sanjay's question. Because many ideas have been read into the Constitution that were not only not in the Constitution, but were not even envisaged in the Constituent Assembly debates. A recent example is the right to privacy. There was no right to privacy in the Constitution. The Supreme Court found a right to privacy when they discussed a particular case, at the end of which they said there is a right to privacy that every Indian citizen has, is inherent in the right to life. Now, similarly, they have found a number of women's rights in the 1990 series of judgments. They found a number of environmental rights that were never explicitly spelled out. And all of this is part of the Constitution's constantly evolving. Plus, of course, amendments have changed many things. Now, the basic structure concept is an invention of the Supreme Court, but it's become as concrete as any words of the Constitution. And the Supreme Court reserves to itself to interpret, the right to interpret what is the basic structure and when the basic structure is in danger of being violated. You'll only find out when you take a case to the Supreme Court and they say, no, this is a violation of the basic structure. So, for example, this question of whether secular should be in the Constitution. 44th Amendment, 1976, Indira Gandhi inserts the word socialist and secular, which is exactly what Ambedkar had said he didn't feel was necessary. Then, when 1977 the Janta government comes, they cancel most of the stuff in the 44th Amendment, but they leave these two words in. When the BJP rises, they challenge these words. They say, why do we need to have these words in the Constitution? They weren't there. Finally, it went to the court. The court said they saw no reason to change these things. The Constitution is secular anyway, but in any case, they said that the words are irrelevant. It's all part of the basic structure. And that was that. So you will have to leave a lot of these things to the Supreme Court. And don't forget, the Supreme Court can change its mind. Judgments of the emergency era, which compromised free speech, for example, which compromised even freedom of association, because essentially the earlier Chandrachud court of 1976 upheld even the suspension of habeas corpus when political leaders were being thrown in jail during the emergency. And those very judgments have been repudiated in later Supreme Court judgments, including by Chandrachud Jr., the son of the then Chandrachud, who also became Chief Justice decades later and undid some of his own father's jurisprudence. So it really is a living, breathing document, and a lot depends, and Ambedkar was the first to point this out, a lot depends on those who are operating the Constitution. He said, even in that adoption speech on 26 November 1949, he said, however good a Constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad if it's operated by a bad lot of people. And however bad the Constitution draft may be, it may turn out good if it is operated by good people. So his message is very clear. Don't just stick to the words of the Constitution. Think of its spirit, think of what he called constitutional morality, and ultimately think of how it evolves and how it's applied by governments yet to come. Fascinating, fascinating. These are the kind of, I've tried to capture some of the magic of all this in the book without being too flippant or light. It's meant to be for interested sort of newspaper reading Indians. It's not a book for scholars or lawyers. It's for people like Sanjay and me and all of you.
So given that he talked about good or bad or the way the Constitution has to be interpreted, I think on behalf of all of you, I need to ask him, so are we going through good or bad times? And are parliamentarians who are responsible in many ways for the amendments. And also, if you can just give us a sense of how many amendments to our constitution.
104, I think. It's the most.
I
It's
think
also the most amended constitution in the
I
world.
think it's 143 or some
No.
such
There have been
figure.
143 bills presented, but not all of them.
Or not all of
Yeah,
them.
it's 104 or 5 are the current.
And in comparison to the American Constitution, 20 odd
No,
amendments?
less. Yeah. I think
20
something
odd.
like, yeah. I mean, the thing is that the American Constitution has been around a lot longer. It goes back to the 1789, and at the same time, it has only had 20 odd amendments, whereas ours, no, maybe not even 20, whereas ours has only been around since 1950. So, in other words, 76 years. And we've already had over 100 amendments. But I don't think this is a weakness of the Constitution. I think it's by design, as Ambedkar said, let the Constitution have the opportunity to keep up with the times, with the needs of the people, with the democratically elected choices of the parliamentarians. And I think that's been a strength, because if you look at our neighboring countries, indeed you look at a large number of developing countries that adopted constitutions, they've had to scrap their entire constitution not once but 3 or 4 times. Pakistan has had about 3 or 4 constitutions in the same time that they've been alive. Not just amendments, new constitutions. Sri Lanka the same. Bangladesh has just scrapped its constitution, and they already had to. So I'm just saying to you that the fact that we have not needed to scrap our constitution or reinvent our country from scratch, that even the BJP, now this is an interesting thing. You may remember, I wrote about it at that time in 2014 when the BJP came to power, there was a lot of talk that they would scrap the constitution and bring in a new constitution. It was even reported that the RSS ideologue Govindacharya was writing the draft of a new constitution. And yet, the BJP's Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced that the Constitution was his holy book. In fact, in his first speech ever to the US Congress, joint sitting of the US House of Congress, he said the Constitution is my only holy book. I mean, as I point out, that's not strictly accurate because it's the Bhagavad Gita that he gives out to visiting heads of state and government. But the message was still, that's how he sees the Constitution as sacrosanct. And the result is that even those who rejected the Constitution, as the RSS had done, have now embraced it. So I would say that we have a Constitution that has stood the test of time, that has withstood a succession of government changes of different political parties, and now has even witnessed the ascent to power of a party whose philosophical forebears in the RSS had explicitly rejected the Constitution, and yet the Constitution has survived. That's quite a triumph.
A very resilient constitution. While we're still at the making of the constitution, Shashi, did you want to share with the audiences that the RSS and the Jansangh, etc., at that point kept harking to Manusmriti as the basis or the fundamental basis of dharma, or the way India should be, whatever. But Ambedkar continued to reject it. Explain why.
No, so that was at that time. That is when the Constitution, because Golwalkar, who was then the head of the RSS, said that any Indian constitution should be based on the Manusmriti. And Ambedkar, who had burned the Manusmriti in 1927, December, he was not going to indulge in any of this.
But just explain why he burnt it.
No, he burned it because it was a very casteist document. It was both casteist and sexist in that the Manusmriti, as popularly understood, though it's a rather large and capacious document, not everything in it may be objectionable, but there are many things in the Manusmriti that are. There's absolutely prescriptive language about caste, the rights, duties, and obligations of various castes. It assumes, for example, untouchability as a given. It certainly prescribes very, very demeaning codes of behavior and standards to women, whether wives or not, all sorts of things like that. And Ambedkar, who was both obviously an anti-casteist and a feminist, he burned it in a very big, a famous ceremony in December 1927 at a protest rally. And for him and many others, that was not acceptable. But I will say the RSS moved on from that. Golwalkar remained RSS General Secretary till 1973. But already by the 1960s, a different critique of the Constitution was being articulated by the political party that the RSS had helped to form, namely the Bharatiya Jansangh, and its General Secretary, who had begun in the RSS and then become the BJS's leader, was a man called Deen Dayal Upadhyay, whom I've quoted in the book because he is amongst the most interesting intellectuals of the Sangh Parivar ecosystem. He came up with the philosophy of what is called integral humanism. And his ideas were certainly very much more moderate than Golwalkar. Golwalkar had said that we should learn from what Hitler has done to the Jews and do the same thing to the Muslims. That sort of talk was in Golwalkar's writings and speeches. Deen Dayal Upadhyay, on the other hand, said, it is nonsense to think in terms of throwing 60 crore in those days. Sorry, what am I saying? How many crores will that be? No, in the time that Deen Dayal Upadhyay was writing, our population was about 500 million, so it would have been roughly, I would imagine, something in the neighborhood of 75, 80 million Muslims. He said it's ridiculous to talk about throwing all of them into the sea. What we have to do is to Indianize them, nationalize them. That was the whole. So there was a very different emphasis between Golwalkar's kind of RSS nationalism and the critique from the Hindutva side that Deen Dayal Upadhyay articulated. His criticism, apart from the fact that it was full of Western ideas and it was drafted in English, which he felt it should not have been, I think Upadhyay would have been happy it had been drafted in Sanskrit, but then no one would have been able to read it. Maybe good translations might have been created, who knows? But his important point was that what was missing was the soul of India. I mean, that comment of Hanumantaya's about the music of the veena or the sitar, in a sense, was also Upadhyay's critique. He had this very interesting idea of chitti. I think many of you understand chitti is sort of the soul spirit, you know, the essence of our Atman being. And he said, to explain what he meant by the lack of a chitti in this constitution, he said that in my village there is a barber who proudly shows a razor as having belonged to his grandfather. But he says, obviously the blade has been replaced many times. The handle had been replaced many times. There was nothing in that razor that actually had been held in the hand of his grandfather, but it was still his grandfather's razor because that chitti was still there. That original razor was in his hand and each change was to that original. That was what the whole idea of, and he said he needed a constitution to create Virat Shakti for India. It's actually a very interesting, you may not agree with it, and certainly I made it clear that I have a very different view, but at the same time I respect the intellectual underpinnings of that critique. Nonetheless, that same political formation, the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, is the direct forerunner in many ways of the Bharatiya Janata Party. The BJP's today embrace of the constitution, to my mind, nullifies those critiques. Because what the BJP is saying is that this constitution is ours, it's our holy book, and we will work within its parameters. So every change they've tried to bring about has only been through amendment. And most recently we have, for example, the whole issue of delimitation after the next census, which is going to create, for example, a parliament of 33% reserved seats for women, which could be quite a remarkable change, but it would also going to give us a parliament with a tremendous weightage of seats for population.
Certainly for UP and Bihar, but let's come to that in a second. Dr. Tharoor, the other thing in the Constitution is language and identity, and the way the states have been formed, very different from, say, the way the United States are a federation where the states have a huge amount of rights to be able to create their own thing, where the governor is all-powerful. In recent times, many of us have read how the 4 governors of 4 different states have refused to read the speech prepared by their cabinet, and in one case, in 3 cases walked out, in one case is read 4 lines. How does this play out today? Language, identity, the rights and the duties of the governor, and the idea of a federal India where rights again and the idea of rights rests equally between center and state, and of course, the conjoined rights that both center and state have.
So you have to understand the evolution of all this. In some ways, the whole notion of the governor was a relic of the British colonial past. But it was there in the Government of India Act 1935, and for whatever reason, the Constituent Assembly did not dispense with that idea. In the British days, the governor had executive authority. The governor could overrule the elected provincial government. Remember, the provincial government only really came into meaningful existence after 1935. So you're talking about only 10, 12 years of actual practice. The earlier British era, there was really no significant role for the so-called Indian ministers or members of the Governor's Council and the Viceroy's Executive Council. They had minimal authority and only in marginal portfolios. But from the elections of 36, 37, you actually had provincial governments which had real authority, and the governor still had the right to overrule them. In the 1949 adopted Indian Constitution, the governor remained, but only as a constitutional figurehead. Partially, they were still enamored with this British model, where the President of India was like the Queen of England, that is, a figure on a throne in whose name things were done, but who actually exercised no real authority. A completely British idea. I have no idea why we went for that, but we did it. And the governor became the equivalent in the states of the president at the center. So at no point was it envisaged that the governor would have any independent executive authority. There would only be the elected chief minister with a parliamentary majority in the states and in the center who would exercise control. So that was the very clear intent, and I don't think anyone can challenge that. That was a clear intent of the thing. However, the Constitution also gave the right to the central government to appoint the governor. So de facto what happened was the governor began to be seen as the center's agent in the states. Many of you are too young to know about a thing called Article 356, which was about president's rule. Under Article 356, the central government reserved the right to dismiss an elected state government and under Article 356 to rule it directly from the center through the governor under the label President's Rule. And Kerala was the first famous example of this when in 1959, after our Vimochana Samaram, you actually had the dismissal under Article 356 of the EMS Namboodiripad government on the grounds that they've been unable to control law and order in the state and direct rule until the next elections took place. Now, I mention all of this to give you that the situation as envisaged in the Constitution and the situation as it evolved in practice had already evolved a bit. Now, in the 1990s, there was a particular Supreme Court judgment which drastically reduced the resort to Article 356. There would have to be a whole series of yardsticks before the central government could dismiss a state government. So you've seen very much less of it, and many of the young people here have probably never seen it really being invoked. But there have been recent examples, of which the most important cases in our recent politics have been Jammu and Kashmir and Manipur, where there was direct president's rule during periods within the lifespan of everybody in this hall. Now, when Sanjoy asks about how governors are asserting their independence, governors have some residual powers. They're not, strictly speaking, executive powers, but governor, like the president, has the right to approve a bill. So the legislature can pass a bill. The president in Delhi and the governor in the state can sit on it, can refer it in the case of the governor to the president, can reject it for reconsideration. But the Constitution again is clear. If it is then passed again with a sufficient majority, the president or the governor has no choice but to sign it. So the legislature's supremacy over the president or the governor is already enshrined in the Constitution. Now, if you look very specifically at the present instances now, they come from other matters. For example, governors in our states are chancellors usually of the public universities. So things like the appointment of vice chancellors come under the governor and not under the chief minister. And there have been clashes in Kerala and in Bengal on precisely that power. There have been other issues. Now, we have this slightly absurd British fiction of the governor's address in Delhi. It's also the president's address to the opening session of Parliament each year. Now, in that address, what the governor is supposed to do is to faithfully read out the address drafted for them by the state government, and in the case of Delhi, by the central government. Now, when both are of the same mind, there is no problem. The president comes and reads it out, the governor comes and reads it out. But when the states have had opposition governments, there have been some real issues of governors feeling uncomfortable reading attacks on the very central government that appointed them. And you can understand, have some water. You can understand the problem of this because, it is a It is a completely sort of fictional thing that it's the governor's speech or the president's speech. It's actually the state government's or the central government's speech. It is merely laying out the program, vision, and priorities of the government. Now, in Karnataka recently, we had an episode where the state government convened a special session of the legislature to object to the bill that would have replaced Manrega with this G. Ramji bill. The entire purpose of the session was to pass a resolution or even an act that would have opposed that bill. So they gave the governor a speech to read at the beginning of the thing that basically said all this, that attacked the G. Ramji bill and talked about Manrega, and the governor refused to read it. Now, this has now reached a bit of a constitutional crisis. We've had similar walkouts from Governor Ravi in Tamil Nadu from the DMK government's draft. We've had examples where governors have skipped reading certain paragraphs of the speech that they objected to. They've read the rest of the speech and skipped these paragraphs, and the state government has actually circulated the text with those paragraphs and decreed that the speech will have been deemed to have been read in full. And that uneasy compromise has somehow survived. But now I think with some of these recent episodes that Sanjay is pointing to, we have reached a point where again the Supreme Court may have to pronounce on how far the governor can go. There is also a serious section of opinion saying, why do we need governors at all? If it is ceremonial work, that can be done by the Chief Justice of the state, such as swearing in the Chief Minister and so on. You don't need a governor for that, they say. If it is chancellorship of universities, either one can be appointed by the state government or that can be the Chief Minister, or it can be some third person. You don't need a governor just for that. And many are arguing that the governor plays a role whose ambiguity invites confusion. Now, this is a debate that is well worth having, but we are not the place to have it. It's a debate that probably needs to be had in the Supreme Court. Just as the Supreme Court, for example, has already ruled very recently, just last year, that governors and presidents cannot indefinitely sit on bills, and there has to be a reasonable time frame where they have to decide either to return it for repassage, or to sign it, or to decide what to do with it. They can't just sit there indefinitely not taking a decision. That famous line of Narasimha Rao many, many years ago, 3 decades ago, saying that not taking a decision is also a decision. That is actually, in many ways, what many governors have chosen to do. By not taking a decision on a bill, de facto, they have vetoed the bill because the bill never actually gets into force. Without their signature, a bill can't get into force. Now the court has put a stop to that, saying you have to do it within a reasonable period of time. And again, of course, the court will be deciding what's a reasonable period of time. So we're going to have to see how all this evolves. But I think this should be an issue. The whole role of governors and place of governors that our country, our polity, and our judiciary will have to look at very seriously.
The other thing that you've alluded to and written about in the book is NRC and its challenge to the Constitution. While the NRC protest movement found traction, it then died out. And as a result of this, would you say that the present Election Commission of India SIR process is in some way a form of continuing what NRC did? And does it, in this case, challenge the very constitution of India and, as you said, the Chitti?
Very complicated question for which there is no simple glib answer. On the NRC, my position was very clear. I spoke about it in Parliament. I'm proud to say I was the first MP to address the Shaheen Bagh protesters who were objecting to it. My logic is very simple. One of the principal features of the Constitution and that animated the spirit of the Constituent Assembly debaters was the rejection of the two-nation theory. The essential issue on which the entire nationalist movement divided was when the Muslim League argued that religion was the determinant of nationhood, and therefore their nationality inhered in their faith. And that's why they insisted on a separate country for people of their faith. That was the entire logic. When that was done in the Constituent Assembly, there were people who stood up and said, now that Pakistan has been created as a country for Muslims, let us make India a country for Hindus. And it was overwhelmingly rejected by the Constituent Assembly on the grounds that our freedom struggle had been a struggle for everyone, and the country emerging from it should also be a country for everyone. This was so fundamental that at no place in the Constitution is religion relevant to the notion of citizenship. At no place does it say that a citizen of India shall be someone who, blah, 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 amongst other qualifications, will be of a particular faith or other faiths. Not there. Which means that there is no division in the Indian Constitution between a person of one particular religion or one particular variant of a religion and any other. Everyone is equal in the eyes of the Constitution and therefore in the eyes of the law. Where I objected to the NRC was that for the first time this cardinal principle had been abandoned by passing a law which specified, in the case of those who are coming and seeking refuge in India from neighboring countries and if eventually discuss their eligibility for citizenship, for the first time specific religions were specified. And to my mind, this was a fundamental violation of the core context in which the Constitution had been adopted. It was a violation of something very, very basic to the spirit of our heart. Now, the BJP's argument at that time, and the Home Minister and I had a bit of a clash on this in Parliament when I accused them of giving Jinnah a victory by essentially vindicating his two-nation theory through their law. Their answer is, this is a law meant to benefit people who are fleeing from neighboring countries which have made Islam their state religion, and therefore it makes no sense for India's laws to admit Muslims who would not be fleeing persecution for that reason. That is simply not accurate, because we have many examples of Muslims from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and elsewhere who have sought refuge in India. It's not only Hindus who have come from these countries and sought refuge in India. What would you do about Taslima Nasreen? She's not eligible under NRC to apply for Indian citizenship, even though she's been living here for almost 30 years. So there's something wrong with a situation that, a law that argues that there should be an acid test of religion before determining your eligibility for citizenship. That was my objection. Now, as you know, the debate got particularly intense when the NRC was linked to a putative national register of citizens. And that register was actually supposed to be something which required documentary proof and so on. And with the Citizenship Amendment Act having now, I'm sorry, we've been mixing up terms. It's a Citizenship Amendment Act that was the first one to introduce religion. But anyway, the Citizenship Amendment Act had introduced the concept of religion. The NRC ostensibly did not, but given that that law was the background of it, once you link it, you are bound to demand greater documentary proof from, for example, Muslims whom you may accuse of having come from Bangladesh, even if they may be Muslims from West Bengal. Then you would demand, say, of a Hindu who would be eligible under the Citizenship Amendment Act anyway for citizenship. So the big problem with this entire debate was the iniquity built into it. Now you ask about the SIR. That's a much more complicated issue, because every one of us who has participated in politics knows that our electoral rolls are less than perfect. There are glitches of various sorts. Every election I've had people come to me to complain that they had voted in the previous election but their names were not there in this election, or that their names were there but somebody had voted in their name, or somebody else would say that there were people registered in more than one booth and they had figured out ways of removing this wonderful mark from the finger. All of these irregularities have been there. So I have no objection to cleaning up the rolls periodically. But doing it in a way that apparently strikes so many crores of people off the rolls does bother me, because the worry is whether the time frame and the speed in which this is being done has allowed sufficient time for genuine voters to be able to establish their presence. You know, you come to my house on a day when I'm not there and you strike me off the roll, that's unfair. So now there are various provisions, there are forms you can fill, there are deadlines that have been extended, there are various other things. But you need to do SIR or whatever, roll revision, intensive or otherwise, in a way that preserves the rights of citizens. That's my main message. It is not that the revision is a bad idea. Many political parties, including in this state, have had a habit of doing duplicate registrations, the same person, the same name, same father's name, same photograph in 20 different booths, and the person spends the whole day going and voting 20 times. I mean, that sort of thing, we've heard cases of this. So I'm not saying this doesn't happen, but cleaning it up, you know, the old principle of Hippocrates when it comes to doctors, above all, do no harm. That should be the principle for the Election Commission as well. Don't do harm to genuine voters in trying to do good by cutting these fakes.
Before we open it up, and I'll open up a second, Dr. Tharoor, did you want to touch upon the abrogation of Article 370, the idea of Jammu and Kashmir, the special rights there, and what did that impact the constitution of today, and how do you see that playing out?
That's also a very complex issue to answer in brief, but Article 370 is what gave special status to Kashmir, and there are other similar Articles 371, 2, 3, etc., which actually give special status to some of our northeastern states. So it's not actually terribly unusual, but 370 was also particularly important because it was the basis of the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India, and it was in some ways the umbilical cord tying the two together. Now, when the Article 370 was abolished, that's also an issue I spoke on in Parliament, and the reason I objected, as I pointed out, was that how did you do it? If you had actually consulted the legitimate elected representatives of the Kashmiri people and then passed it, no one could have objected. There is a provision for that in the Constitution. It is also not true that 370 was completely sacrosanct. It was listed under the schedule of the Constitution saying temporary provisions. And even the Congress party, when they passed it, said there's a temporary provision. So it's not that you can't abolish it, but what you do, you declare president's rule, you suspend the elected assembly, and then you ask the governor whom you have appointed whether he agrees to the abolition of 370. He says yes. He owes his job to you. He says yes. And then you decree that Kashmir has been consulted and they've agreed. That, to my mind, is an incredibly dangerous precedent because you can do it to any state in India. Let's say tomorrow central government decides it wants to break up Tamil Nadu into two states. What is to prevent them doing exactly this? Declare president's rule, ask the governor to give the view of the state. Governor says, yeah, do what you like. Central government can do it. I mean, I know that it's a very far-fetched scenario, but in theory, as a precedent, that's exactly what you've done to Kashmir. You've abolished the assembly, you've asked the governor, you've abolished 370, you've broken up Kashmir into essentially two chunks, J&K as a union territory, Ladakh as a different union territory. Now, that's not something which the Constitution founders certainly envisaged, and it seems to me that these are issues that need airing, need debating, and fortunately, our system encourages and permits serious debate on all of this. But the outcome, when you've got a massive majority in the legislature, in parliament, the outcome is much less easy to ensure.
I would have loved to ask Dr. Tharoor about personal liberties and rights and some of the people who have suffered because these have been denied them. But let's get some questions from the audience.
So my question is, sometimes you have taken position which may differ from Rahul Gandhi and other opposition leaders. So you have sometimes taken political stand position which may differ from Rahul Gandhi and other opposition leaders. So my question is, do you feel such differences could unintentionally weaken such collective opposition against the divisive politics of the
collective
party,
opposition?
which is a threat to the Constitution of India.
Fine.
Hello, sir. I'm Apurva Jha. I'm a student here at Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode. My question to you was, you talked about America having around 20 amendments in the Constitution, and in India we have had around 104, 105. What do you think this tells about India as a society? Are we more of an intolerant society or a revolutionary society?
Intolerant or revolutionary society? The gentleman in the blue who's standing up.
Hello, sir. So my question is, in the Constitution, it is said as sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. So how would you differentiate the secularism which is prevalent in India than to that of secularism in France? Because secularism in France is basically much more...
We got the question. Thanks so much. And the gentleman here in front.
Good morning, Dr. Tharoor. I am Vijay Chandran Adhyarat from Palghat. Democracy emphasizes our constitution as a constantly evolving and a dynamic force which ensures that citizens have their rights protected. But in an era where constitutional values are being hotly debated, how can ordinary citizens go beyond casting their vote and uphold the values of
The
democracy?
duties of ordinary citizens. So take that. So Rahul Gandhi, are you by disagreeing?
Secularism and
Yeah.
this, yeah. So let me take the two constitutional ones together because essentially they relate to the same thing. The amendments of the Constitution do not testify, in my view, to the weakness of the Constitution. They do reflect the fact that our society is in a state of evolution. We inherited a society after 200 years of colonial rule. We were busy shaping a nation and we were creating fundamental changes which required amendments because the Constitution and the Constitution makers could not have foreseen every one of them. I've in a couple of pages in the book tried to summarize some of the major amendments and you'll see the details. We're running out of time, so I won't go into it. But those details, to my mind, are worth looking at because you'll see why the constitutional amendments are part of taking India in a direction as a society that is very different from what it was back in between 47 and 49 when the Constitution was debated. I hope that addresses both aspects because the gentleman's question, if I remember right, is also about how the Constitution as a living document has mirrored these changes in our country, in our society, and I hope that it will continue being a vehicle in many ways for transformations. On the question of secularism, the French have a literal understanding of secularism. If you look up any English dictionary, secularism implies a distancing from religion. And that means that essentially there is a total separation between church and state, and because as a result, in France, you cannot go to a government school wearing any signs of your religion. You can't wear a Sikh turban. You can't wear a crucifix. You can't wear a Jewish yarmulke. No sign of your religion is permitted in a government school or in a government office. If you're habitually wearing a pagdi and you need a service from a French government official, you would not be allowed in if you're wearing a pagdi for the sake of your religion. So they're very, very strongly insisting upon separation of religion from the state. If you want to study and you insist on wearing your crucifix, go to a Christian school. That's kind of the message from the state. In India, secularism did not mean that. Secularism actually meant a profusion of religions. It was a reflection of the pluralism inherent in our society, where so many religions are practiced by so many people in so many different ways. So the state is not supposed to favor any single one of them. It favors one, it can favor many. So for example, the state is involved, or was involved for many years in sponsoring a Hajj pilgrimage. The state has been involved in subsidizing certain temples in certain places, or running, there were some boards running the management of, so the state has not distanced itself from religion, but it is supposed to help equally all religions. And you know the minority rights for certain educational institutions of minorities, all of that. So our situation is very different. It becomes particularly interesting when you get this debate in Hindi, because the original translation of secular is dharma nirpekshata for secularism means keeping a distance from religion. And the BJP's critique was, how can you be distant from religion? Dharma is part of every good Indian has to follow his or her dharma. How can you be distant from dharma? That's wrong. Secularism is wrong. That was the argument. But if you translate secularism as panth nirpekshata, keeping apart from specific sects, where what you are trying to do is the government does not say we are a Hindu state or we are a Christian state or we will support a particular religion, that is a more logical understanding when it comes to the Hindi debate. Finally, on this political question, I was here to discuss the Constitution and not politics. But let me say very clearly, if you look at any of my public statements and record, I have at no stage violated any of the party's positions in Parliament. The only issue on which there's been a public disagreement on principle has been about Operation Sindoor, where I did take a very strong stand. Let me say to all of you that I remain unapologetic about that, because after Pahalgam happened, I myself, as an observer and commentator, which I also am, In Parliament, we have lawyers, we have doctors, we have business people. We also have some writers, and I'm one of them. And as a writer, I had written a column in the Indian Express, the North Indian Express, which I think I gave the title after Pahalgam. They gave it the title, Hit Hard, Hit Smart. And what did I advocate in that article? I said, number one, this cannot go unpunished. There has to be a kinetic response. In other words, we have to hit them. I said, equally, we are a country focused on our development. We do not want to be dragged into a prolonged conflict with Pakistan. And I said, we are a country dependent on external investment. Investors don't like war zones, so we can't take a step that will turn India into a war zone. Therefore, hit only terrorist targets, a finite number of them, and signal very clearly that we Indians are only attacking terrorism. We're not attacking Pakistan. It's Pakistan's inability and unwillingness to curb terrorism that has obliged us to do this. And I said, don't give Pakistan any further excuse for escalation. This is what I wrote. It's in black and white. You can Google me. Hit Hard, Hit Smart, Shashi Tharoor, Indian Express. Now, you can imagine my astonishment and frankly joy when 10 days later or whatever it was, the government of India did exactly what I recommended. Now, how do you expect me to criticize what I myself have recommended? I supported it fully throughout Sindoor and afterwards. Secondly, when the government sent me, they sent many other leaders of many other parties on multi-party delegations. For some reason, my party did not like my doing this. Apparently, you can speak to them and find out why. But as I said publicly in response, and I will repeat again today, it was Nehruji who asked the very famous question, who lives if India dies? When India is at stake, when India's security, national security and place in the world is at issue, India comes first. Political parties are important. They are a vehicle to create a better India. We can disagree with each other on the ways to do that, but whenever India's interests are involved, India prevails. That's my very simple answer. Thank you all very much, and Jai.
We're going to release Dr. Tharoor's book in Malayalam. Also, as we know, the whole presidential issue is up for debate. Should India have a presidential system? I think we would have all voted for Dr. Tharoor as the president of India.
Now, we move to one of the most awaited moments, the launch of the very new book by Dr. Shashi Tharoor. May I now kindly invite Mr. Sanjoy K Roy to formally launch Malayalam translation of the book, Our Living Constitution. Everyone, please give them a huge round of applause.
So this is the DC Books Malayalam edition of Our Living Constitution. Available right here. Thanks very much.